Most people watched the Joe Rogan Experience episode with Mel Gibson and thought it was just a conversation. Back pain, wildfires, movies, nothing unusual. But when GROK analyzed the full transcript, it didn't see a conversation. It saw structure, a progression, a message that wasn't said directly, but built piece by piece until you had no choice but to understand it. At the beginning, everything feels normal. Gibson talks about his back, chronic pain, the kind of thing people say when they're just talking without thinking too much. Rogan agrees, adds his own experience, and for a moment it sounds like every other long podcast conversation. Comfortable, familiar, safe. But GROK doesn't process conversations the way humans do. It doesn't get distracted by tone or personality. It tracks patterns. It maps how ideas evolve over time. And the first thing it flagged wasn't dramatic. It wasn't controversial. It was a single line that most people didn't even notice. Everything emanates from the core. On the surface, it's obvious. The spine supports the body. If it's damaged, everything connected to it starts to fail. That's basic biology. But GROK marked that line as the origin point, because right after that, the conversation begins to expand. Not suddenly, not in a way that feels forced. Slowly, naturally. They move from the body to systems, from systems to structures, from structures to society. And suddenly that sentence isn't about the human body anymore. It becomes a framework. If the core is broken, everything built on it starts to break. GROK identified this as the first layer, not a claim, a foundation, because from that point forward, to every topic that enters the conversation connects back to that idea, even when it's not mentioned directly. When Gibson talks about California, it sounds like politics, mismanagement, billions spent with no results. But structurally, it fits the same pattern. Resources exist, systems exist, but the outcomes don't match the intention. And instead of saying, this system is broken, he keeps reinforcing the same concept without repeating it. The core is broken, so the system produces broken results. Then Rogan brings up collapse. Not randomly, he references Jared Diamond and his work analyzing civilizations that failed. Rome, the Maya, Easter Island, societies that didn't disappear overnight. They declined gradually. They ignored warning signs. And they continued operating as if nothing was wrong even when everything was already shifting beneath them. GROK marked this as the second layer, because now the conversation isn't about one place anymore. It becomes a pattern across time. Civilizations don't collapse because of one event. They collapse because their internal systems stop working, while people continue pretending they do. And the key detail GROK identified is how this idea is delivered. It doesn't feel like a warning. It feels like a casual observation. That's what makes it effective, because the listener doesn't resist it. They accept it without realizing the implication. And the implication is simple. If collapse follows a pattern, then the pattern can be happening right now. Gibson reinforces this by bringing up apocalypto. Again, it doesn't feel like a major shift. He explains why he made it, not as entertainment, not as a historical recreation, but as a reflection, a depiction of a society that had already begun collapsing internally before anything external destroyed it, a system that maintained power by consuming its own people. And this is where the conversation starts to change, because Gibson says something that sounds like a throwaway line. We still do that, we just dress it up. Most listeners hear that and move on, but GROK didn't. It flagged that sentence as the third layer, because it introduces a concept without explaining it directly. The idea that modern systems might produce the same outcomes as ancient ones, but in forms that are harder to recognize. Not visible rituals, not obvious structures, but systems that generate harm in ways that feel normal, bureaucratic, processed, hidden behind language. And once that idea exists, everything before it changes meaning. The broken core isn't just inefficiency, it's something deeper. The collapse pattern isn't just historical, it's repeating. And the idea of systems harming people isn't accidental, it's structured. GROK identified that moment as the point where the conversation locks in, because now every idea connects. There are no separate topics. Back pain becomes metaphor. Systems become extensions of the core. Collapse becomes inevitable if the core isn't fixed, and harm becomes normalized within those systems. But what makes it powerful isn't what's said, it's what isn't said, because at no point does Gibson directly explain the full idea. He doesn't define it, he doesn't break it down, he lets the listener assemble it themselves, and that's why it sticks. So because when people arrive at a conclusion on their own, it feels real, it feels earned. GROK tracked the pacing of this process. Every few minutes, a new layer is added, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to deepen the structure, and each layer builds on the previous one without breaking the flow. That's why the conversation feels natural even when it's moving into complex territory. Then something subtle happens. The conversation stops expanding outward and starts turning inward. Instead of just describing systems, it starts questioning why those systems behave the way they do. Not explicitly, not in a direct question, but through repetition of patterns, misalignment between intention and outcome, resources that don't produce results, structures that fail consistently across different contexts. GROK identified this as a transition phase, because once patterns repeat enough times, the brain starts searching for a cause, not a surface explanation, a deeper one, something that explains why the same structure produces the same outcome even when variables change. And that's when the conversation prepares for its biggest shift. But it doesn't announce it, it doesn't signal it, it just happens. Because by now the listener has accepted every previous layer without resistance. The foundation is broken. Systems reflect the foundation. Civilizations collapse when systems fail. Harm can be embedded within systems without being obvious. That entire structure is now stable. And once it's stable, something else can be added on top of it. Something that would have been rejected if it appeared at the beginning. But now, it feels like the only explanation left. And that's where everything changes. At one point, the conversation stops being about systems. It stops being about history. And without warning, it shifts into something most people hear, but don't actually process. That's where GROK flagged the moment everything changes. By the time the conversation reaches this point, the listener thinks they understand what's happening. It feels like a critique, a discussion about broken systems, failed leadership, repeating historical patterns, something intellectual, something grounded. Even when it gets slightly darker, it still feels explainable. But that's exactly where the shift happens. Not when things feel extreme, but when they still feel normal. Gibson introduces the idea casually, almost too casually. He says there are forces, not ideas, not philosophies, actual forces, good and evil, active, competing, and most listeners don't stop there. They register it as belief, personal worldview, something separate from the rest of the conversation. But GROK didn't separate it, it connected it, because structurally it fits perfectly. If the core is broken, if systems reflect the core, if civilizations collapse in predictable ways, then the next question is unavoidable. Why do these patterns repeat even when people recognize them? Why do systems that are supposed to improve conditions often make them worse? Why does correction fail so consistently? GROK identified that this is the moment the conversation answers that question without directly asking it, not through evidence, through framework. Because if forces exist that influence outcomes, then systems are not neutral. They don't just respond to human intention, they shape it, direct it, distort it. And that idea doesn't get introduced as a dramatic claim. It's inserted the same way everything else was, calm, unforced, which is why it bypasses resistance completely. There's no argument, no debate, no pushback, and that's what makes it effective. Because the listener doesn't feel like they're being told something new. They feel like they're continuing the same line of thought. GROK mapped this moment as the activation of a second layer running parallel to the first. Everything before this point operates on visible structures, governments, economies, historical events. Everything after this point begins to operate on invisible influence, direction, intent, pattern consistency across unrelated systems. And once both layers exist at the same time, the conversation becomes something else entirely, because now every example can be interpreted in two ways, A failed system can be seen as incompetence or as consistent output. A harmful outcome can be seen as accident or as alignment with a deeper structure. And the listener starts noticing something they didn't notice before. Consistency. Patterns that shouldn't repeat as often as they do. Outcomes that don't match intentions across different environments. GROK didn't interpret this as proof of anything. It interpreted it as pattern reinforcement, because once the brain sees a pattern, it starts looking for it everywhere, and the conversation feeds that instinct without ever saying, "This is what's happening." It just keeps presenting examples that fit the same structure. Gibson then explains something that seems small, but GROK marked it as critical. He says institutions that deal with meaning, anything that connects people to truth, purpose, or something beyond the physical, are the most effective. Not sometimes, not occasionally, necessarily. That word matters, because it removes randomness completely. If something is necessary, it happens by design, not chance. And once that idea is introduced, the entire conversation tightens, because now the listener is forced into a new perspective. If institutions that define truth are influence, then perception itself becomes unstable. Not fully false, but shaped, filtered, directed in ways that aren't immediately visible. GROK identified this as the tension point, because this is where the conversation stops being comfortable, not because it becomes aggressive, but because it introduces uncertainty. If the systems you rely on to interpret reality are not fully reliable, then your understanding of reality is partially constructed, and that realization creates a subtle discomfort. Not enough to make someone stop listening, but enough to keep them engaged. Noise. Because the brain wants resolution. It wants to stabilize the model again. But the conversation doesn't provide that stability. It deepens the instability. Gibson starts referencing real-world examples again, but now they feel different. Before, they were illustrations of broken systems. Now they feel like outputs of something consistent. Decisions that don't make sense if you assume good intent. Outcomes that benefit structures even when they harm individuals. GROK flagged this shift in interpretation as the strongest retention driver in the entire conversation. Because the listener isn't being told what to think, they're being shown patterns that force them to think. And once that process starts, it doesn't stop easily, because every new example reinforces the same structure. And the more reinforcement there is, the harder it becomes to dismiss. At this point, the conversation has built something very specific, a model where the foundation is compromised, systems reflect the foundation, collapse follows when systems fail, harm can exist within systems without being obvious, and now, influence exists beyond the system itself. That's a complete framework, but it's not finished yet, because it still doesn't answer one thing. What does this lead to? If everything is structured this way, if patterns repeat, if influence exists, then what's the direction? What's the end point? And this is where the conversation becomes even more controlled, because instead of answering that question directly, it creates pressure. It increases the number of unresolved points. It expands the model without closing it. GROK identified this as deliberate, because unresolved structures keep attention locked. If everything was explained, the listener would disengage, but when things are left open, the brain keeps searching. That's what creates the feeling that something important is being said, even if it's not fully clear. And that's exactly what happens here. The conversation doesn't collapse under its own weight. It stabilizes. All the layers connect. Nothing contradicts anything else. And the listener reaches a point where everything feels aligned, but incomplete. And that's intentional. Because once the structure is stable but incomplete, it becomes ready for a final piece, something that doesn't just add information, but resolves the entire framework. And that piece doesn't come as an answer. It comes disguised as something else, something most people hear as casual, something that feels unrelated. But GROK marked it as the most important moment in the entire conversation, because it's not random. It's the only thing that can complete the structure that's already been built. And once it's introduced, everything before it makes sense. Near the end of the conversation, something happens that most people ignore. It sounds like a side comment, something casual. But GROK flagged it as the point where everything finally connects. After everything that's been built, the broken foundation, the repeating patterns, yet the idea that systems reflect something deeper, the suggestion that influence exists beyond what people can see, the conversation reaches a point where it can't go any further without collapsing or resolving. There's too much tension, too many open loops. The listener has been pulled through layer after layer without being given a final answer. And the brain doesn't like that. It wants closure. It wants something to stabilize everything that's been introduced. But instead of directly answering anything, Gibson shifts. He mentions his next project, a film, something about resurrection. On the surface, it feels completely disconnected, almost like the conversation is winding down, like he's just talking about work, about what he's doing next, about something practical. Most listeners treat it that way, a normal ending to a long discussion. But GROK didn't interpret it as an ending. It interpreted it as the final layer, because structurally, it fits exactly where it needs to. Everything before this moment has been building pressure, not emotional pressure, structural pressure. A system has been described that feels unstable. A pattern has been identified that feels unavoidable. A framework has been constructed that explains failure, collapse, and harm, but doesn't offer a way out of it. And that's the key. There is no solution inside the system that's been described. If the core is broken, you can't fix the system by adjusting the surface. If patterns repeat across civilizations, you can't stop collapse by making small changes. If influence exists at a deeper level, you can't correct outcomes without addressing the source. The entire conversation leads to a single conclusion without ever stating it directly. Whatever the problem is, it can't be solved from within the same structure. GROK identified this as the moment where the listener reaches maximum cognitive tension, because now there are only two possibilities. Either the entire framework is wrong, or the solution has to exist outside of it. And that's where the mention of resurrection comes in. Not as religion, not as belief, as structure. Because in the context of the conversation, resurrection isn't presented as a historical event or a spiritual concept. It's presented as a form of reset, a break from the existing system, something that doesn't operate under the same rules that everything else has been shown to follow. And that's why it works, because it doesn't feel like an answer. It feels like the only thing that fits. GROK mapped this as the completion of the entire structure. The core is broken. Systems reflect the core. Collapse follows when systems fail. Harm becomes normalized. Influence exists beyond the visible layer. And the only way out is something that doesn't depend on any of those systems. That's the full loop. And what makes it powerful isn't that it tells the listener what to believe. It doesn't. It just removes every alternative. It builds a structure where every internal solution fails, until only one category of solution remains, something external, something fundamental, something that operates at a different level entirely. And because the listener arrives at that point themselves, it feels real. It doesn't feel like persuasion. It feels like realization. So GROK's final analysis didn't say the conversation contained hidden facts. It said the conversation was constructed in a way that guides interpretation, step by step, layer by layer, from something simple to something that feels much bigger than what was actually said. Back pain becomes a metaphor. The metaphor becomes a framework. The framework becomes a pattern. The pattern becomes a model. And the model leads to a conclusion that was never directly stated. That's why most people don't notice it, because nothing in the conversation feels forced. There's no moment where it announces what it's doing. There's no shift in tone that signals importance. Everything flows the same way from beginning to end. And that's exactly why it works, because the listener doesn't resist what they don't recognize. They just keep following the structure. And by the time they realize something deeper was happening, they've already reached the conclusion. That's what GROK identified. Not a hidden message, a constructed one, built in a way that feels natural, but leads somewhere very specific. And once you see that structure, you can't unsee it, because every part of the conversation points to it. Every transition reinforces it. Every layer depends on it. And the final piece, the thing that seemed the least important when it was mentioned, is actually the only thing that makes the entire conversation complete. That's why GROK flagged it. Not as an ending, as the point where everything finally makes sense. And once that connection is made, The conversation isn't just a conversation anymore. It becomes something else, something most people heard but didn't actually understand.